might as well get started now. So I would love to say that I began my introduction into the realms of paganism and witchcraft after I wrote a fabulous book that sold millions and millions of copies and is now renowned worldwide. But that wasn't my story. I started putting myself out there in the world of paganism online. And if any of you follow me on Twitter, you know where I'm going with this now. And about 2 years ago, I put a post up about an aspect of Welsh magical traditions, which some of the ladies in the room might want to get a notepad out now because this will be useful. But essentially, I found this little tidbit of information, you'll understand that pun in a moment, which was just glorious, which was that Welsh women, once upon a time, if they were a bit annoyed at the men in their lives, the way that they would deal with them was by cursing them. And the methods they used to curse them was that they would run in front of the man, fall onto their knees, lift their arms to the heavens, and they would start screeching at the top of their voice as many swear words and insults in Welsh as they could think of. And if you've ever heard Welsh swear words, you can imagine a very angry Welsh woman on her knees in front of you with her arms up like this, going, "Ffwciadur contoin!" and just screaming, with all the acts and the all of them. And then, to put the kind of icing on the cake, they would lift up their tops and they would flash their tits in full display. They would grab their tits and they would just fling them around, screaming, shouting curses. One example of this was a woman who grabbed her tits, flung them in someone's face, and shouted, "These yellow tits have given suck to those who will wash their hands one day in your blood." And I just love that. So, if anybody interrupts me or has any criticism tonight, so put ideas in your head. So that's how I kind of got onto the scene. I started putting out information like this, and ever since then I've been using my platform to talk more about Welsh magical traditions, because, as you can guess from that little foray into Welsh magic, it's interesting, it's fun, it's nice, isn't it? So, my name's Mhara, I hope you all know that by now, and today we're going to be talking about Awen, and my lovely assistant has already gone back. But Awen is the word that we use in Welsh to describe the otherworld. And the otherworld kind of underpins a lot of the magical culture and traditions of both the myths and legends of Wales, but also just the magical traditions that followed later. So whether you're interested in druidry, I know there's some druids here today. I'm watching. We also have some paganism, some bardic arts, some witchcraft, and some fairies mixed in here and there in this talk. So hopefully there's a little bit of something for everyone. But fair warning, I come from an area of North Wales where a common way of saying hello to someone in the morning, no matter whether you are a teenager drinking lager at the bus stop or whether you are a little old lady with her stick, the way that they say hello to people up there is "Iawn cunt," which translates to "You're right, cunt," and everybody uses it. So if you're offended by swear words, you might want to leave. So moving on from that, so I wanted to introduce quickly a little bit of an insight into Welsh magic today and the various expressions that Welsh magical practices take today. Because I put myself out there as a Welsh witch. In my native language, I refer to myself as a swinwraig modern, which just translates to a modern enchanter or a modern witch, essentially. But there are 3 different kind of approaches that tend to exist if we have to box them up into different types within the world of Welsh polytheism, paganism and witchcraft today. The first is the pagan reconstructionist approach. This is the approach that people take in terms of trying to revive and bring back a form of paganism and polytheism that existed once upon a time in Wales before the Christians came, before all that shit happened, essentially, and they're trying to bring back the reverence and the way in which we honour the landscape and the gods and the magic of this place. I don't fall into that one. The next one is a folk magical approach. So the folk magical approach are usually your traditional witches, the people who practice a witchcraft or a magical practice that is inspired and informed by the folk magical practices of the past. And that's kind of where I sit, but not really, because where I sit is the next one, which is, I don't know what to call this one, so I just call it inspired and informed by the past, rooted in modernity. So essentially, the way that I look at my practice is that I take elements of older pre-Christian practice and polytheism, I take elements of folk magic, like the tit curses that you all just listened to, and I take elements of modern witchcraft and paganism, and I kind of breed them all together in a little mishmash and create a fusion of a practice that just works for today. So I don't pretend like I'm some pagan from long, long ago who, you know, is trying to worship the gods of Wales as the people of pre-Christian Wales did, nor am I pretending that I'm a village witch serving her community in the 17th century. I'm practicing what is relevant to the here and now. And every single one of these different streams of Welsh paganism and polytheism have kind of problematic elements, and they're seen as a bit controversial. For example, there is the question of, when it comes to Celtic reconstructionism, paganism, is that even possible? Because we live in a world that has iPhones and computers and buses. So is it really possible to be revering the gods of ancient Wales in the same way that they did? I don't think so. And for one, because they didn't bloody write anything down, so we don't know what they did at all. The other one is that folk magic tends to be a little odd. So, for example, if you were to go back and try and create a practice that was just entirely like the folk magical practice of the cunning men and women of 17th and 18th century Wales, who, you know, were the everyday people who helped the community via their magical knowledge and such, you would end up probably getting arrested, because some of those magical techniques were things like, oh, do you want somebody to fall in love with you? That's fine, go murder a puppy at a crossroads, and then go shove that puppy in an old lady's face, and then take the blood of the puppy and rub it on your genitals. I don't think any of us want to be doing that, do we? So essentially, my style is that I take inspiration from these things, and I go, rather than killing a puppy, why don't we use a stuffed toy that I bought from Oxfam last week, you know? That kind of thing. So my style is very much an acceptance of the fact that we are modern people living in the modern world. So we can take inspiration from these things in the past, but we don't need to be emulating what they did exactly. And the main priority of a practice like the third one, like the one I'm explaining now, is what works. What actually works, you know? Because I know some people who get very in their heads, like, is it traditional? Is it old? Is it rooted in the pre-Christian past? And my main question is always just, does it work? Does it work? So the reason I'm introducing this to you tonight is because we're going to be exploring the concept of anoven. Anoven. That's quite a fun word, isn't it? It's like someone saying an oven, but with a bit of an accent. Anoven, if you want to practice it. And we'll explore what that means in a second. But the reason we're bringing this up is because Anoven and the beliefs surrounding the Otherworld kind of fit really well into a magical practice or a pagan polytheistic faith today. So, the one thing that connects all three of these styles, whether you're a reconstructionist, whether you are a folk witch or a folk magical practitioner, or whether you're like me and you're just a bit of a spiritual mongrel and you like to mix little things together and make a practice that works today, the one thing that works in every single one of them is Anoven, the Otherworld. This is that one thing which connects all streams. Whether you're a pagan, a witch, or something in the middle, all of them will take inspiration, draw inspiration from Anoven. So in order to explore that, let's first explore that word. So Anoven, I don't know if you can see that, but it's spelled A-N-N-W-F-N, Anoven. And the word Anoven in and of itself teaches us a lot about what people believed about the Otherworld. It gives us a whole story, because that's kind of how Welsh works. The Welsh language in and of itself has a really odd history, in that it derived and originated from a language called Common Brythonic. which was the old Celtic Brythonic language that was spoken across pretty much all of Britain at one point. I've done a lot of kind of moots and events and such in the south of England, in the border up near Scotland, here tonight in Stockport and such. And a lot of people often, when I come to these events, they kind of go, oh, I don't have an interest in that because I'm not Welsh, I'm English. And then I'll say to them, but you do realise the land you're walking on now, once upon a time, people here probably spoke a Brythonic language, which is the ancestor or the parent of Welsh. So I don't know if, do we have any Welshies in the room tonight? Oh, lovely, there are a few. So if you are Welsh, or you've been around Wales a lot, or if you're just on Facebook and you have a few friends that happen to live in like Barry Island or something, you've probably seen people share memes that say things like, you know, Welsh is one of the oldest languages in all of Europe, right? That's kind of true, but not really, because technically Welsh, as we know it today, isn't one of the oldest languages in Europe. But the ancestor of Welsh, Brythonic, which isn't that different, is one of the oldest languages in all of Europe today. So they spoke a Brythonic language, something similar to Welsh, in Scotland, England, Wales, Cornwall. They still do in Cornwall, some of them that speak the Cornish language. It's a Brythonic language, because the Celtic languages are split into the two groups, Brythonic and Goidelic. So the Irish and the Manx, and nowadays the Scottish, but that's just because the Irish jumped over the sea and went there and took over from the what would be ancestors of the Welsh at some point as well. So they all spoke a common Brythonic language, and essentially, at one point, they realised that when they were having big festivals, big events, where lots of these different Brythonic tribes came together and were essentially sharing poetry, because poetry was really important to them, they didn't really fully understand one another, because they spoke a variation of the Brythonic language that was specific to their tribe or their people. So they kind of came together and they thought, okay, we need a common language. We need a language that we can all speak, or at least we can all say our ceremonial poems in, and everyone will understand what we're saying. And what happened was they fiddled about with that for a few years and created a language specifically for poetry and magic, and that language was Welsh. So when we talk about the Welsh language today, and people say to you, you often see things online, people saying, oh, it sounds like the language that dragons would speak. It sounds like the language that witches in fantasy movies would utter their spells in and such. When people say that Welsh sounds inherently magical, they're not wrong historically, because that was the purpose of it. The purpose of the Welsh language initially was for poets and bards, which were used in ceremonial events, usually in things like ceremonies where they were making a king, so ceremonies where they were coronating or creating a tribal leader. They would use the language to utter invocations and incantations, and that language that they used in those invocations was Welsh, was what we now call Welsh. It evolved into Welsh. So it's really hard to define Welsh words. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen those memes that talk about words like hiraeth and Awen and all of these kind of special Welsh words that it's very hard to give them a direct translation. Awen is always translated to mean inspiration, but if you ask any Welsh person, does Awen mean inspiration? They'll go, kinda, but not really. Same with hiraeth. So many people say hiraeth means homesickness, and if you say that to a Welsh person, they will look at you as if you've just bitten their head off, because no, the fuck it doesn't. Hiraeth is something much deeper than that and much more visceral. And the reason it's hard to pinpoint exactly what these Welsh words mean is because they often mean lots of different things, depending on the context and such. So I'm sure some of you have probably tried to learn certain languages from across the world, where it's like, oh, the way you intone that language or the way you say that word, like it can mean 17 different things at once. It's kind of the same for Welsh, but we don't have different tones. We just have the same word, and context will denote whether or not that word means this or whether it means that. So when we try to define words like Awen, which is the word for the otherworld, it's difficult, and there's lots of theories. But essentially, the easiest way to try and translate the word is by telling a story, is by weaving a narrative. Because that was the point. It was a language derived for poetry. So the point was that every single individual word had to be a story, a poem in and of itself. So the word Awen is comprised of two words kind of squished together, an and noven. And these words are interesting in that they literally give us a narrative for what Awen means. So specifically, one of the primary theories, and the ones that most scholars tend to go for these days as to what the meaning of Awen is that the an bit, it essentially denotes something being very something. To use academic jargon, it's an intensifying prefix. So it's a prefix that intensifies whatever word it's in front of, which is different to modern Welsh, because if you see the word, the letters an in front of a word nowadays, it's usually the opposite. It's not something. So we have words like cyfforddus, which means comfortable, and if something is anghyfforddus, then it's uncomfortable. But in older Welsh, it was an intensifying prefix. So an essentially denotes something that is very, very something, and then noven comes from the word doven, and doven is a word that we still use in the Welsh language today, and it's essentially just deep. So we'll say things like, oh, mae'r pwll yma'n dofen, neu difen. So that pool over there is really deep. So anofen, if you think of it like that, intensifying prefix and then deep, it's essentially the very deep, the very, very deep. And there's lots of ways in which we can interpret that. So one of the ways we can interpret that is by looking at mythology. What does the very deep mean, and what does that tell us about the other world when we compare it to how it showcases itself in mythology? Well, Awen, because it means the very deep, and because it describes this otherworldly place, in recent years, especially from the 19th century and the 18th century onwards, the church started using the word almost as a synonym for hell, which was really stupid because we already had a word for hell in the Welsh language, if-then, which, you know, is a horrid word, if-then. So they didn't need to use this word to describe hell, but they did. And if you read books from that period that talk about folklore or mythology, they will often say Awen, the Welsh hell, the Welsh underworld, the Welsh Hades, it's our version of Hades. But that's not quite true, because then you read the stories and you're given a completely different image of Awen. Because Awen isn't this dark, depressing place where the dead go. It's very much a place filled with life. So, for example, in the Mabinogi, when Pwyll Pendyddeg, a prince from the south of Wales, goes into the other world, it's kind of not mentioned that there is a clear divide between our world and the other world. He walks in there very, very easily. He's got this glorious, what I imagine, hunk guiding him in called Awen. Gosh, Awen, I have a thing. And he guides him into this place, and it's described as being pretty much like our world, just that everything is a little better, just a bit better. So essentially, it's like the UK if Boris Johnson had never been born. So he walks in this place, and it's like the grasses are greener, the sky is bluer, it doesn't rain as much, and the buildings are made of this glorious quartz, which almost sounds like heaven, really, doesn't it? Rather than hell. So it doesn't quite make sense why the Christians glomped onto it as a hell. But I suppose their mentality was, well, the Welsh have this place, and it's called Awen, and it's not heaven, because we have heaven, that's called a nef, and there can't be anything else, so it must be hell. It must be an illusion. But when you're reading that, it's like, unless it is an illusion, then that's a completely polar opposite to hell. However, it's not quite heaven either, because it is very much like our realm. You can still get hurt there, you can still get killed there, and there are still animosities. The whole point of the first branch of the Mabinogi is that Pwyll takes the place of the king of the other world in order to fight a battle for him, because Awen keeps fucking it up, basically. And he's like, you do it for me instead, which is what I do with everything I have to do in life. I ask him, I just go, you do it instead, he'll do it better. So the otherworld of mythology is a place of abundance. It's a place that is full of treasures. It's a place that is full of beauty. The people there are said to dress in like garments made of golden silks, golden brocaded silks. They're all living in opulence. It's all very kind of regal and amazing, and everyone's drinking out of golden goblets and such. So it's a place of plenty, it's a place of beauty, and it's a place of life. It's a place where people are very much alive. It's not where the dead go. It's not where the ancestors go to rest. It's just kind of almost like a mirror image of our own world. Because the way it's described is essentially being exactly like Wales during the medieval period, but better, if that makes sense. So it's described as being this one territory. Sometimes it's split into islands, and it's split into various kingdoms, and that's exactly what medieval Wales was like. It was one territory split into all these little kingdoms. So that's the otherworld of mythology, and we can perceive that as kind of almost like it's a deepening of our own world, you know? It's like if we went deeper into the crevices of our world, we can uncover this strange liminal place that isn't accessible all the time, but is accessible sometimes, that is just better than our world. Next after that, we have the otherworld of the bards, which kind of coincides with the otherworld of mythology, except that the bards believed that the otherworld was the birthplace of all Awen. I don't know if you can see the word on the screen there, but Awen is spelled A-W-E-N, and it's this glorious word that cannot be literally translated. You cannot translate Awen into an English word, but Awen essentially denotes this blessed kind of holy force. It's this energetic force that creates and carries inspiration. So if you were a bard in this period, and going back now to what I said about the evolution of the Welsh language and how it was created for poetry, one thing you need to acknowledge is that poets were not the same in the past in Wales as we think now. Now, it's very easy nowadays when we say a bard or a poet to imagine a very skinny little twink in his bedroom, smoking a cigarette, listening to Lana Del Rey and writing sad poetry, right? But the bards back then were kind of like this very high-ranking fraternity almost. Not quite fraternity anymore, because now academics have realized there were women, but at some point in history, someone tried to cover up that there were women bards, but there were, and a lot of them wrote great poetry about things like the power of the cunt. So, very good to look into, the women poets of ancient Wales. But the reason the bards were so high up was because they belonged, essentially, to the kings. Every king needed a bard, because the bard had this almost magical quality. They had this magical power about them, in that via their words, via their mastery of words and language, they could change society as a whole. If they sang the praises of a king beautifully, then the people in that area, in that kingdom that that king ruled over, had faith in the king. They saw the king as noble and amazing, and all that bard had to do was do the opposite, sing poorly of the king, and he could bring that king down. So a good bard who will sing your praises and essentially utter this poetic magic out into the world, which makes or breaks a kingdom, that kind of helps your knights be ready for battle, that helps your people feel like they have confidence in you, that bard was very important to the king. So bards had this mystical quality, but also this important status in society. And the best bards, the ones who could utter the most prophetic, the most powerful, the most beautiful poetry, were in touch with Awen, this force, Awen. So Awen has this like kind of strange ability in that it exists in the otherworld, but it channels into our world consistently. So the idea of Awen is that it is forged by divine hands, and this is according to some of the old poetry. The poets would talk about how the divine would shape this force, and this force, like a river or a breeze, a gentle breeze, would then extend out of the other world and kind of seep into our world. And once it seeped into our world, we breathed it in, and once we breathed it in, it kind of started to take form within us. So it isn't quite like, you know, how some Christians talk where they say things like, oh, God has moved me, and now I've created this poetry. It's not quite that. It's not like the spirit, the force has moved me, and it's the spirit or the force that has created this poetry. It was more like a symbiotic relationship between the humanity of the bard and the otherworldly quality of Awen. So Awen would seep in from the other world, enter into the bard's body, and then ruminate inside them for a bit before the bard eventually just went and puked out a bunch of amazing poetry that then they could move entire civilizations with. And the other world, Anoven, was where Awen was born. So to the bards, they felt that they constantly had a need to connect to this other place, to this otherworldly place because they needed to get some of that inspiration out. And the ways in which they did that were often via methods that we might call today ecstatic practice. So they go into trance, they would enter into really dark rooms. Dreams were really important incubators for the Awen as well, and they could bring forth prophecy and poetry via going into these states of being. So when we think again, going back now to the meaning of Annoven, the otherworld, the very deep, well, the bards had to go very deep into themselves, into a trance or into a meditative state, in order to bring that Awen from the otherworld into themselves. So you can define it as being a very deep place in our world, or you can define it as being the very depths of us on a more kind of psychological level. So it's the deepening of our own reality, but also the deepening of our own senses and our own being and our own minds. And then we go to the folklore of the otherworld of folklore. Gosh, what language am I speaking? The otherworld of folklore kind of took that idea of the very deep and just made it very, very literal. So the otherworld of folklore became a place that was accessed via deep, deep lakes. So you have all these stories of like some drunk Welsh guy in Caernarfon called Awen who's walking home one night pissed out of his head, and he falls into a lake, and then he kind of starts drifting down to the bottom of the lake, and eventually he realizes he's not floating to the bottom of water anymore, he's falling through the sky. And then he flops onto some ground, and he realizes he's in the other world. And there's a really fun story about that, where this one guy falls into a lake, goes into the other world, walks up to this otherworldly castle, knocks on the door expecting to see a beautiful fairy come out of the palace. And then this man walks out, who is described as being about 4 foot tall, looking like a toad, bald, hideous, covered in warts, which just shows you, never ever assume what a fairy should look like. Because they could look like beautiful maidens, or they could look like hideous men with warts all over their heads. So yeah, it just depends which one you get. So the otherworld of folklore was literally a deep place. It was under the sea, it was under lakes, it was accessed via caves, it was found in the deep, dark places of the world. There's a 12th century story which has kind of warped the way in which the Welsh have perceived the otherworld forever, in that that story is about a priest who during his youth went and lived with the fair folk for a certain amount of time as a child. And when he went there, the way that he accessed it was via a door that opened up at the bank of a river, and when he walked into it, it was literally this chthonic or underground space. It was constant twilight, constantly misty, but also very beautiful. And the reason it was in constant twilight was because the sky in this other world was essentially the ground of our world. It was completely flipped, a flip image. So the other world of folklore, literally the deep place like that. So you have all of these different streams, and every single one of them we can take a different interpretation of the very deep. You have the very deep of our own reality, almost like seeing a deeper state of our own place in the world, which some people just say is just people eating magic mushrooms, essentially, and seeing the deep state of the world. And then you have the bards who would go into these deep ecstatic states within themselves. And then you have the other world of folklore, where people fall into lakes or go too deep into a cave and end up in some fairy realm and have a jolly good time until they come back and they realise they fucked themselves up and everything goes tits up. Moving on from there. So the next part of this is to look then at the otherworld and magic. So after all of these different versions of the otherworld that existed through time, from the oldest mythologies to the folk tales of the common people, we then have this idea that common everyday people who happened to practice magic started building a relationship or a rapport with the otherworld. So, for example, magicians of Welsh lore, as well as magicians of Welsh history, started being associated with the otherworld. So one thing that's really interesting about Wales, and the history of Wales in general, is that we didn't really have witch trials in the same way that the English did. So compared to England and most of Europe, we didn't go through as much of like an intense witch craze. So to give you a very clear image of that, over here in England, I forget we're here, aren't we? England today, there was upwards of about 2,000 people taken to court on accusations of witchcraft. And of that 2,000 that were taken to court, 500 or so were found guilty or executed. Whereas compared to Wales, where we had 42 people, compared to 2,000, taken to court, and of that 42, only about 4 people were ever found guilty. It's a huge difference, isn't it? They have the same thing going on in Ireland as well. They didn't have as many witch trials, but they've got water separating them. We don't have that. You know, people can just walk, can't they, from Wales to Shrewsbury if you happen to want to do that for whatever reason. So how this happened has always stumped academics. Like, why were the Welsh just apparently not interested in killing witches at the same rate that the English were? And there's lots of different theories as to why that is. One of those theories has to do with the fact that essentially the Welsh courts were petty, which I can understand, and they essentially looked over the border and went, the English are doing what? They're killing witches? We're Welsh, we're not going to do that. We want to be different. So it's essentially a way for the Welsh courts to go, we're different, we're independent, we're not governed by those courts in England, we can do our own thing. So that's one theory. Another theory is that we cared too much about our sheep and our cheese to care about witches, because when you contrast and compare the amount of people who were accused and executed on accusations of being thieves versus witchcraft trials in England, they almost parallel each other. So the amount of people that were taken to court on accusations of being a thief matches almost the amount that were taken to court on accusations of witchcraft here in England. And then the other theory has to do with what we're talking about tonight, so the otherworld and specifically fairies, because that's one area of the otherworld that was very apparent in folklore, was that this otherworldly place was where fairies came from. And remember, I'm assuming most of you will know this, when we're talking about fairies, we're not talking about what we might think of as fairies nowadays. We're not talking about Tinkerbell. We're not talking about little ladies with glorious wings. We're talking about essentially otherworldly entities, otherworldly beings who look pretty much like us, but they have something about them that is inherently magical and other. And most people were scared shitless of these things. They did not like the fairies. They didn't want anything to do with them. They were scared of them, and they wanted to keep as far away from them as possible. So the theory as to the witch trials and fairies is that essentially the Welsh didn't have as many witch trials because if something bad were to happen, they were more likely to blame fairies than they were to blame witches. So whereas in Essex you might have Cindy Lou down the road going, oh my god, my cows have all died suddenly, it was Karen. Karen's a fucking witch. Kill her now. In Wales, on the other hand, up in like Carnarvon or in Hadelech or whatever, if Cindy Lou, who probably is called something like Shan over there, walks out and sees all of her cattle are suddenly dead, she's more likely to go, oh crap, what have I done to offend these little buggers now? And their first point of call after that, the English person's first point of call would be to go to the authorities and go, Karen's a witch, kill her. The Welsh person's first point of call would actually be to go essentially to a witch. They would go to a magical practitioner, to a magical specialist, a swyn wraig, a dyn hysbys, a consiriwr. These are the words that we have in Welsh for the magical practitioner that lived in the community. They would go to these people and they would say, my cows all just bloody died. What can you do so that I don't offend these little fuckers again? Help me. And that was one of their responsibilities. The magicians, the magical specialists, the cunning folk, and the witches, their entire kind of, what's the word in swydd? Job. Their entire kind of career, job, was essentially dealing with these messes that the other world created. So they would provide people with spells and with cures and with different kind of apotropaic devices. That's a big word for Mara. Apotropaic devices, protective devices essentially. Something that you can hang up in the house to keep the little fuckers away. And that's kind of one of the main reasons that people went to them. They would go to them if they were worried that their child had been swapped by a fairy child. They would go to them if they thought that they'd offended them in some way, and the magical specialist knew how to deal with them. So in order to know how to deal with them, they needed to know them quite intimately. They needed to know how they worked, how they operated. And so the idea was that the magical specialists, the magicians and such, had a relationship with these things from the otherworld, with these fairy beings. There's even one book that I read recently which talked about a witch who lived in a cave down in the south of Wales, and in the text it said, and I'm going to throw a very big Welsh word at you now, it said that she was chyfathrachuing, which is like, that's an intense word, isn't it? Chyfathrachu. And I didn't know what that meant. So even I, with my first language Welsh ability, was like, what the fuck is that word? So I went over to a Welsh dictionary online and I went, what does that word mean? And it's essentially, like all Welsh words, it can mean different things. So you can interpret the translation of that story as either being this witch lived in a cave with the fairies and had very close friendships with them, or alternatively, this witch lived in the cave with the fairies and they were bonking like rabbits constantly. So there's even this implication that magicians and fairies were at it like rabbits. We were going off and fornicating and creating magical babies and such. So there is this deep connection between the magicians and the fairies, so much so that you will very rarely, if you go into the court records of Wales and look up these witch trials and such, very rarely will the figure of the devil come up, whereas he tends to come up a lot in English witch trials, doesn't he? They tend to believe that the devil is kind of the witch's master, and they all bow down to the devil. In the same way that they did that in England, the witches and the people who practiced magic in Wales bowed down to the king of the fairies and had very intimate relationships with the fairy folk, which is a very different story to what you see on Facebook and such nowadays, isn't it? When people are either like, fairies are love and light and beautiful and perfect and they will bless you with magical glittery fluff or whatever, or on the opposite end they're like, don't fuck with the fairies, don't do that at all. The Welsh were like, no, do fuck with the fairies. Literally. So looking at all of that, looking at all of those different threads, how we have these different interpretations of the otherworld, go back now to what I said at the beginning and how my practice is essentially, I look at these different sources of information and I thread them all together to create a practice that is inspired and informed by the practices and the traditions and the beliefs of the past, but are rooted in the here and now. So there were various ways to connect to the otherworld within traditional lore. You had the bards who connected to the force of Awen in order to create their poetry, and there's very explicit instructions on how they did this, whether it was, as I mentioned, the trance-induced states, the meditative-like states, or another way was via beats. Not beetroots, as in like beats, actual beats. So they would have these sticks, these big sticks, called, I think it was perchan or something like that. And they were these big massive staffs essentially, and they would gather in a circle, and there were these things called perpetual choirs. And the perpetual choirs were groups of these mostly men who would gather around and they would just intone a sound, usually a vowel-like sound. Some of them would intone different sounds. So they would go, we do have vowels in Welsh, by the way, before I go on to that. So they would intone a vowel, and the vowels in Welsh are a, e, I, o, I, u, e. A, e, I, o, I, u, e. Yeah, got more of that. So it's A, E, I, O, W, Y, oh, I can't do it. Those are the Welsh vowels. So they would stand there and they would, in these perpetual choirs, essentially just intone like, and such. And, you know, if you can imagine a group of about almost 100 people doing that at once, it creates like quite an intense vibrational sound, doesn't it? And then to make it even more powerful, they would have these perchans, these big kind of sticks that they would hold and stuff. And pistun, not perchan, pistun, not perchan. Perchan, pastun, not pistun, that sounds dirty. Pastun. Yeah, because a pencan is a little thing with holly in it. I don't think that would quite work. So, yes, they would hold these big sticks and they would tap them against the floor in a rhythmic quality. So if you can imagine that, just this reverberating, vibrational sound of like an eh, or an ah, or an e, like a vowel sound, and then also the constant rhythmic beating. And they would just stand there in these choirs, and they were perpetual. They were just constantly ongoing for days and days. They would take shifts. They would swap over. They would go sleep and have drink and food, and somebody would switch in with them. And in those places, in those spaces where they would have these choirs singing, it would invoke sounds of the otherworld. And the reason that those kind of traits worked, the reason that intoning sounds and using rhythmic quality worked, was because Awen is associated with the voice and specifically with the breath. So Awen can be translated to mean poetic kind of inspirational force, but the word itself shares an etymological root with the Welsh word awel, which literally means breeze or a light breath. So the implication within that word is that Awen, this divine inspiring force which connects you to the other world, but also helps you to open up prophetic wisdom and poetic wisdom, it literally is of the breath, it is of the word, the spoken word. So essentially, the spoken word is inherently a magical thing, and those who are able to weave and work words in a certain way were inherently magical as well. So, yeah, do with that as you will. I'm sure that your heads might be whirring right now. If you're a magical practitioner or a pagan, or especially if you're somebody who maybe has a druid order or a coven or something, you can imagine doing that, can't you? Gathering in a circle, intoning these words in order to bring forth something of the other world to that space. It's just a rather intimate and magical way to empower a space rather strongly and profoundly. So that's one way that I take inspiration, is I look to things like that. Another example is entering into translate state. We go to the next one. So for example, there are these people called the Awen. That's a nice sexy word for you. Awen. The Awen literally translates to mean the inspired ones, the inspired people. And these came a little later than the bards. The first example in written record of somebody being an Awenydd, which is the singular form, and Awen is the plural form, comes to us from a 12th century text. And they're described as being these people who, via their spiritual kind of abilities, would enter into a trance-like state. They would connect to this force of Awen and to the force of the divine, and then they would spit out these prophetic words of wisdom. And to anybody listening, those words would sound like utter tripe and nonsense. It literally wouldn't register as anything. But to the person that they were essentially consulting, those words meant everything. They would utter out these words and a message would be gleaned from those words. So the Awen were kind of like your original version of Psychic Sally, you know, the person you go to down the road for a tarot reading. It was essentially the version of that in the 12th century, but they were associated with this concept of Awen again. And then we also have the fact that fairfolk, or fairies in particular, were connected with the magicians, going back to that, you know, the intimate relations that they had with the magicians. Well, another place that kind of took hold within the Welsh magical beliefs was that the magician had a familiar spirit, but the familiar spirit wasn't like a demon that took animal form, as we see in some kind of court records and such. The familiar spirit could be either a spirit that was conjured specifically for magical means, and usually kept within a book or a bottle, or otherwise, it was a fairy. It was literally a fairy being. So you have these things called puka in Welsh culture. The puka are essentially little shits. You don't want to mess with them. The puka are like 5-year-olds on steroids, essentially. My God, they go mad. They do the most horrific things. They like to do horrible things to you just because it's fun. And specifically, they love to torment Christians. They love to torment specifically priests. But there are some stories where over a certain amount of years, because the puka usually live out in the hills and out in the countryside, but they have this uncanny ability to transform themselves into something like a ball of yarn, or a pen, or a cup, and enter into your home. And once they're inside your home, they're stuck there, and they become the biggest pest you've ever had, essentially. But there are stories where after a few 100 years or so of being with the same family for a certain amount of time, the puka starts to grow kind of fond of the person that they're haunting and they're taking the piss out of. And though they don't stop being shits, they do start doing nice things here and there for them. So they were essentially the original form of like Facebook, because the person who lived in the house would go up to the puka, wherever the puka might have lived in the house. They would knock on their little abode and they would go, "Hey puka, you're a little shit, but I really want to know what Rob's getting up to on Thursday nights, because every Thursday night I can hear weird screaming coming from his cottage over the road. Can you tell me what Rob's getting up to?" And then the puka would go, "BDSM, innit? Into all that dodgy shit, yeah, sex parties, you know, keys in a bowl kind of things." And they would sit there going, "Oh, tell me more." So the puka almost acted like a gossip junkie. They would go and find information, they would tell them things that they needed. And they would also deal with crap for them as well. So if you said, "Oh, you know, her down the road, she's really pissed me off this week. She has been an absolute terror to me. She's been getting on my case because my dog was barking once on Wednesday night. Can you go sort her out?" And the puka would be like, "All right, I'm going to go sort her out." And then you'd have to specify, "Don't kill her." Just be mean to her. So the puka, this fairy spirit, which is usually a nuisance, starts to become a familiar spirit for the cunning person, the magical practitioner. And the longer they became a familiar spirit, the more powerful that magical practitioner in the village started to become then. So you have these stories where it's like, "Oh yes, I'm the local cunning man, I fix all the issues in the village via my magic." And it was kind of like an old advertising service where you'd go, "And everybody knows that I'm the best and the most authentic cunning man in the area because my family's had a puka as a familiar for the last 200 years." So it was a way that they would advertise their services even further. You know. Yes, and then the next thing that we kind of can take inspiration from for the otherworldly practices is if you are of a polytheistic nature. Because there's lots that we can take in terms of magical practice and in terms of folk magic and things like this, you know. You can go and try and become friends with your puka if you want. Carefully. Or you could try and connect to the other world for prophecy, for divination and things like this. But then if you are like me and you also revere gods in your practice, if you're somebody who likes to connect with the old gods of the land, then the other world also has this association with gods as well. So there's this old Gaulish word. So the Gauls, they're kind of our cousins over the sea as well. They lived in kind of northern Europe, parts of like what is now France and such. And they were Celtic-speaking people, and they spoke a language very similar to what we speak in Wales today. And they had this concept called yr andedion, the andedion. So andedion essentially means the gods who are of the other world, the gods who are of the world beyond our own. That spoke to them. The andedion, yes. So the andedion were essentially the gods that were not of our world. They weren't, you know, the gods back then were usually part of the natural landscape. So before the Romans came here and such, the Celts never really had human-looking figures for their gods. Not much, anyway. We have some evidence that it happened now and then, but for the most part, the Celts didn't like to fashion their gods into the image of humans. The Romans liked to do that, and we inherited it from the Romans. But what they did kind of view as gods was the landscape around them. So it would be like that mountain is a god, the river is a goddess, and we still have kind of evidence of that in place names and such today, both in England and in Wales. So like the River Severn carries something of Sabrina, which is a Roman goddess, but there's also hints that she also has an older Celtic equivalent in Havren and Habren and such. So we have this quality of names preserving some of the names that might have been used, or something similar that might have been used to honour the gods of this landscape before. So those were usually the gods that people kind of called to and connected with, were the rivers, the trees, the mountains and such. But then you had the gods that came from beyond that. And the gods of the otherworld, or Andedion, we've kind of adopted this Gaulish term now. We said, you know what, it sounds like Welsh, so we'll just use it too. So Andedion, they are the gods who are accessible to us mostly via water. So for example, we have evidence that the Celts and the people of this landscape long before we existed loved to toss things into water. We still do today, it's just they were throwing swords instead of bottles of Ribena. So they would toss these really valuable things, you know. One of the best examples, there's a lake on Anglesey called Llyn Cerrig Bach, which translates to the Lake of Little Stones. And back in, I think it was the early 2000s or the 90s, something like that, they found a huge hoard of items that were just thrown into this lake, probably as an offering to the gods. And the things that they threw into this lake were like really shitting expensive. Like they threw these massive cauldrons and a carriage, a newly created carriage more or less. It's like they went to a Mercedes dealership, bought a brand new car, and just threw it in a lake, just for fun, because that was what their gods needed at that time. So it's obvious that the watery aspect of lakes and rivers and bodies of water had this connection to the other world. Over on the continent in Gaul, we see it as well with springs or wells and such. So there's a specific well in France that was dedicated to the god Maponos, and loads of things were thrown into that, to the point where there's evidence that they built an entire like little pier to go over the well so that people could throw their offerings in, and they'd have to pay someone at the front. So it's kind of like the old Iron Age version of an amusement park. It's like, don't go to Disney World, go to Maponos' shrine, that's where you need to go, because you can bless yourself, or you can curse your enemies there. Double the fun. So we can look to these things and also connect to the gods of the other world as well, in similar manners to how they did. Now obviously the way we might interact with the gods today might differ to how they did 2,000-3,000 years ago, but we can still look to the ways in which they connected to the gods and take inspiration. And within Welsh practice, gods that are associated with the other world are gods like Rhiannon, Gwynap Nudd, and Ceridwen and such. So I'm sure some of you have heard those names before. So those are kind of the gods that you might want to connect to. In particular, if you like the idea of connecting to Awen, that inspiring force, then Ceridwen is the one you'd go to, or even possibly Taliesin. But I'd rather Ceridwen, she's a bit more cute. So yes, putting it into practice, there are various ways to put the other world into practice, and knowledge and an understanding of the other world. You have different practices that you can create yourself. One that I've created is called the Mine Awen, which is to use a hagstone. So we've all heard the kind of common story that goes around with hagstones, haven't we? Where a hagstone, if you peer through it, you can see it's the realm of fairies and such. Well, there's an entire kind of spirit that's gathered around that now. So there's this idea that hagstones are almost like this connecting force between us and the other world. So when I'm feeling not that inspired, I have a hagstone, and I've dedicated that hagstone in the name of Ceridwen. I took it to Llyn Tegid, to the lake in Bala, and I bathed it in the waters of Ceridwen. I gave an offering to Ceridwen. Then I took it home and I consecrated it in the name of Ceridwen. And as a writer, as somebody who writes books and sometimes gets writer's block, when I'm feeling like I'm in that mode where I'm just like, I can't write, why am I doing this? Who am I to write a book? Oh my gosh. I'll go and grab my Mine Awen, which translates to inspiring stone, and I'll hold that hagstone against my brow, because one of the most inspired, the most connected entities in Welsh lore associated with the Awen was Taliesin, and Taliesin translates to the radiant gleaming brow. So I'll hold it against my radiant gleaming brow, and I will give a little prayer to Ceridwen, and then I'll just sit there and I'll allow that Awen to flow through that hole from the other world into me, and it works almost every single time. It's almost like a little ritual that I work every single day. So that's an example of how we can draw inspiration from these different threads that we've learnt about tonight and create practices that work for us. Another way, of course, is devotional practices to the gods of the otherworld. We've already talked about the gods, but we can build relationship with those gods today, and I would say that connecting to sacred water is a very fine way of doing that, understanding and acknowledging the sacredity of water and such. I personally view poetry as a very intense form of connecting to otherworldly forces, especially because within the Welsh mindset, poetry is inspired literally from the otherworld. So when you're in that creative part of your life, when you're literally sat there trying to create something, you are drawing power from the otherworld in that moment. So using your poetry in devotional and magical acts is a fairly powerful thing, especially if you're doing it with a hope of connecting to Awen and such. So I will always use poetry in prayers to the gods, in spells and invocations. I always try and use specific meters and specific styles of poetry and things like that. And then there's also the idea that we can work with fairies. So I know these social medias, TikTok, will tell you to run a mile before you work with fairies. But essentially within Welsh culture, the belief was that normal, ordinary people stayed the hell away from fairies. They wanted nothing to do with them. But for people like us, the magical specialists, they had to have a knowledge of the otherworld. They had to have a knowledge of fairies. So I think that delving into those scary things can be useful as well. And yeah, go to the next one because I've already done that. And if you'd like to learn more about that, shameless self-promotion now, I've written a book. 2 books, actually. So I've got 2 books. Welsh Witchcraft is already out now, which touches briefly on some of these topics, but mostly looks at a magical practice that is inspired and informed by Welsh folk magic. Whereas my next book, Welsh Fairies, is more of a slightly, I hesitate to use this word, slightly inspired by scholarly kind of investigation into what the otherworld is, how we connect to it and such, but it touches on things like the Awen, the otherworld, fairies, all of these different things, as well as gods and goddesses of the otherworld. So Welsh Witchcraft is out now, and if you'd like to grab yourself a copy, I don't have any with me tonight, but they are available online wherever you buy books. You can order them from Waterstones or in your local bookshop, or if you're coming to the Halkin Castlewood Pagan Fest, which is run by Kate and the Pagan Federation people, then I'll have some there, as well as at the Preston Conference, which I'm sure you'll be at as well, won't you? Yes, which Rob will be at as well. So if you're coming to the Preston Conference or the Halkin Wood Pagan Fest, I will have copies then. But Welsh Fairies isn't out yet. That comes out in September, and that deals with exactly what we've talked about tonight, but obviously I didn't have to kind of squeeze it into an hour. I could talk about it for as long as I wanted, and I bloody have 100,000 words about fairies and all that stuff. And that comes out September, probably October for the UK, because it's published by an American publisher. And if you don't want to buy my books and you'd rather instead to listen to my free content, I've got a podcast, I've got a YouTube channel, I've got a Facebook, an Instagram. I'm going to repeat something that I've said about 1 million times at different conferences. I am a rash. Now that you've rubbed up against me, you're going to need some anti-Mhara fungal cream. So yes, come find me wherever you want. I do have a few business cards, which are very pretty, that I've just had printed, and I'm very proud of them. So if anybody wants to kind of look into how to get in touch with me, come and see me at the end. But thank you so much for listening to me prattle on about the otherworld and Welsh stuff all night. Diolch o galon. Before we all get pissed, does anybody have any questions or any specific comments or anything like that that they'd like to share? Oh, yes?
I'd just like to say thank you so much for that talk, because you've wakened in me things I've forgotten about. I've lived in England far too long, that's what it is. But you're speaking about things I was brought up to believe. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Love to hear things like that.
Here on that as well.
Thank you so much.
Born in Wales, lived in England. Too much of my life.
To reconnect.
Yes, absolutely.
Is anybody else before we head on? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being a lovely
The car should have done us.
Yeah, right.